Welcome back. So in this episode, we'll do a bit of refactoring. Refactoring is the process of changing code, changing its structure, without changing the underlying behavior. So often you will get code to work, and then you'll do a second pass where you change it. You move this up here, and you move that down here. You move this to its own file. Now, the underlying functionality or the behavior is still going to be identical at the end of the road. However, you've modified its structure, you've improved it, or you've refactored it. So this episode, I'm going to push your limits a good bit. I'm going to introduce some new things here that might be a bit above your fighting weight. So I totally understand it'll be tough. Watch this video a couple times if you need to, and then we'll move on. So I'll be there right with you. Okay, so we want to refactor this. I said in the last episode that this is a kind of a good start when you're kind of stepping into these waters, but in real life, most of us don't have functions or methods called fetch all tasks that delegate in this way. So why don't we try to divide this into better responsibilities? And luckily, you learned the basics of classes a couple episodes ago. So let's think about it. I'm going to create a new folder called database to start. This will be the home for anything related to working or connecting to my database. And notice I said connecting. So right off the bat, that's what this code does right here. It connects to our database. That is a responsibility. So what if we created a dedicated class for that instead called connection or connector? Let's stick with connection. Okay, so don't forget we use the class syntax, connection. And now I'm going to use a method here called make, but I'm going to make it static. And this is a new term. So yeah, again, I don't want you to worry about this too much other than to accept that it's a way to make a method accessible globally without requiring an instance. So for example, like this, if I wanted to call the make method, I would have to say connection equals new connection, and then connection make. That is how I can call this public method. However, if it's static, I could actually do this. I don't need an instance. I could just say connection, and I use this : syntax to designate that I'm calling a static method. So I could say connection make. And generally, you want to be a little careful or thoughtful about this. There are times when it's not a good choice. However, for our needs in this case, I think it'll work just nice. So in situations where you do not require an instance of a class, you just need to perform a bit of logic, a static method can be useful. But yeah, we'll dig into statics a bit more further down the line. Okay, so here is how we make a connection. Okay, so now if I ever want to get a fresh database connection, yeah, I could essentially do this. PDO equals connection make. So that will trigger this method, and it's going to try to return a new instance of PDO. And if anything happens, currently we're just dying. In real life, you might want to bubble up this exception, and then you'll have a global exception handler that figures out what you want to do in the situation that we couldn't connect to our database. But for now, a call to die is fine. Okay, so we have one responsibility: make a connection. That means I can come out here and remove this. And further, well, let's say we were sticking with fetch all tasks. I happen to know that we're not, but for now, we'll do this one step at a time. Require database connection.php. And now I get rid of this, and I instead say connection make. And let's see if everything still works. Let me boot up a server. Localhost, let's do port 8887, and I can command click on this. Okay, and sure enough, we see exactly what we had before. So we did our first refactor. And notice again what I meant by that. What we ended up with is exactly the same. However, we moved things around. We restructured our code, but the underlying behavior remained the same. That is a refactor. Okay, but now, yeah, fetch all tasks. I mean, think about it. You're going to have lots of things in your system. So are you going to have another function for fetch all comments and fetch all projects and fetch all users? It gets pretty messy pretty quick. So why don't we instead, let's figure out what this is. What are we doing here? Well, we are building up and executing a query. So we are building a query. Okay. Well, why don't we create a class called database query builder and let this class be responsible for building up queries. Okay, so let's go back. So what is this really doing here? Well, it looks like it's selecting everything from a table. So maybe we could have select all, and then you give it a table name. And then I can paste this in here. Okay, but now notice that, well, the function's trying to access PDO. And if you remember before, we were just passing the PDO object over to any function that needs it. Yeah, that's kind of awkward, right? Oh, why does fetching all tasks need PDO? Well, it's just something we have to do to get it to work, but from a user's point of view, somebody using this code, it just isn't very intuitive. So instead, let's think about it. The query builder, in order to do its job, needs access to a PDO object. And that's a good way to think of it. When you define your classes, just think, well, what other things does my class need in order to do its job? For example, imagine you're hiring a contractor to fix up your house. Well, the contractor might say, in order to do my job, I'm going to need the plumber, I'm going to need an electrician, I'm going to need a designer. So you can think of all those people, the electrician, the plumber, the designer, as collaborators. And if, in fact, we were to write that in code really quick, we have our contractor, and he's going to perform some work. But in order to do this work, he needs help from an electrician, a plumber, and a designer. So he needs these 3 different collaborators in order to do its job. So that's where we can defer to the constructor. So if you remember a couple lessons ago, I noted that, the constructor is like the place for a class to declare what its dependencies are, or what collaborators it requires to do its job. Our contractor might say, I need an electrician, I need a plumber, and notice it's not saying specifically that it needs Joe the plumber, it just needs any plumber who can do that role. And it also needs a designer. And so here is where we would define them. This electrician equals whatever electrician you passed in. Once again, the contractor, in our particular case, doesn't care. He just needs one plumber who can do the job. And then we would define these here. So this is a very common setup that you're going to see in most PHP classes. And that's all there is to it. You have a class and you decide, well, what collaborators, what do I depend on in order to do my job? Now, it's true, the contractor could do the role of the electrician, and he could do the plumbing, and he could do the designing, but it's going to break apart really, really quickly because he or she is stretched too thin. They're trying to do way too much work, and if you think in the context of code, if he's doing all that work, this class is going to get so muddy where you never want to work with it because it's way too long to figure out what's even going on here. So instead, we delegate, which is good in general. The contractor delegates to the electrician and the plumber. Okay, so I hope that helps to make sense. Now, if we come back to our query builder, we decided in order for the query builder to do its job, well, it needs access to a PDO object. So we're going to pass that in here, like so. Or, a little tip, in Sublime Text, you can do some research and find little macros where you can define all of this at once. Kind of fun. Okay, so for the query builder to do its job, it needs access to a PDO object. And we can even do things like this, and this is referred to as type hinting. Think of it as a way to say, I don't want an integer as PDO, I don't want a string, I don't want an array, I want an instance of the PDO class. So you can add that on, or you can make it dynamic and just trust that whoever creates this object will know to pass in the right object. Lots of things to talk about there, so I'm going to leave it off for now. Okay, so now we're going to let our collaborator prepare a query. And now in this case, I'm not going to hard code to-dos. Instead, we're going to pass it in. Select star from table name. Okay, so execute it. Fetch all, well, we can't rely on it being a task because we could be fetching projects or comments. So we'll tackle that in a minute, but for now, I will delete that. Okay, so how does this look to you? We now have a new query builder class that is responsible for building up queries. And in order to do its job, the query builder depends upon a PDO object. All right, so let's see. Let's close all of this out. Back to index.php. Fetch all tasks. We don't want that anymore. So I'm going to go to functions, and we're bringing it right back to what we had before, just a simple DD function. And in fact, we're not even using that in this case. So for our demo, I can remove that file entirely. So it sounds like we need to pull in our query builder. And how do we instantiate it? We new it up and we inject an instance of PDO. So something like this, new query builder. And now here's our connection, right? Let's take a look. Connection make returns an instance of PDO. So that's exactly what we could pass. And we could call this query or anything you want. If you want to call it DB or builder, anything you want. Maybe query. And then we can say, well, I want to call any method on the query builder, like select all. So let's select all from the to-dos table, and we'll save that. Okay, so let's go back to Chrome and see if everything's working. I give it a refresh, and I still get the exact same thing. So once again, we have a successful refactor where we are now delegating to each of these responsibilities. But now we can see that in our index.php file, we're doing a lot here. So we're requiring a connection, we are requiring a query builder, we are making a connection, and then we are instantiating a query builder. So we're doing a lot more than we were before. It's cleaner and it's easier to modify because we have these little small responsibilities that are easy to edit and change. But we have some bootstrap work here now, don't we? So maybe, as a first step, we could move all of that into its own bootstrap.php file, like this. Create the file, and now let's grab this stuff and move it in. So now the bootstrap file will be responsible for kind of the behind-the-scenes work. I mean, if you think about it, for our index file, do we really need to think about how we connect to the database and how we create a query builder? Don't we really just want to say at the end of the day in this file, I just want all my to-dos and then load a view? I mean, that's kind of what I want. But currently, we're having to do all of this kind of programmery work, which isn't great. So instead, maybe we can pull in a bootstrap file, and the bootstrap file can then be responsible for doing some of this work. Now, do you see here how we define a variable, and the only place we ever use it is right here? Well, that means if you want, you can just inline it. Connection make, and then get rid of this. And now if you ever do this and the line gets a little long, I'm actually pretty sensitive myself to really wide lines. So in those situations, by the way, I think this is fine. But if it was something like this, where it keeps getting longer and longer, I might do something like this, where I move it onto its own line. Okay, but now in this case, yeah, we could save it as kind of a global variable, or we could be explicit and just return. And then here, when we require it, we can save whatever is returned from that file to a variable that we're going to call query. Okay, so now, yeah, think about it. This stuff, it doesn't need to be in index.php. It is now stored here. So this is almost like a little factory file, isn't it? It's a file that serves the purpose of being like a factory, and it builds up our query builder, and it figures out what query builder needs, in this case PDO, and it builds that up, and then it just gives you the result, just like a real-life factory. Okay, so I can delete all of that, and let's see how we're doing. Give it a refresh. It still works, so that was a good refactor. And the last step, well, let me show you. If we die and var dump the tasks, you'll see that in the last episode, they were instances of task. But we removed that, so now they're standard classes, they're dummy classes. Now, what if we still want to map the database results into task instances? Well, we could be very complex and create a specific mapper that defines how we map those results into task instances, or we can stick with exactly what we had before. So for example, if I hardcode that one more time, give it a refresh, now each is an instance of task. And further, we could have methods here that we call on each of those. But yeah, we can't hardcode this. So let's change it into a variable, like into class, and then we'll accept that here. Yeah. So now we can say, give me everything from the to-dos table and map them into instances of task. So if we now come back and refresh, there you go. Each one is a task. Or, yeah, I mean, there's so many ways to do this. What you could do is bring this back, and then you can be responsible for how you map it, like I said earlier. So for example, right now, you'll have std class, And then we have all these array functions that you can use, and I haven't taught you any of them yet. But there are things like this, where you can say, map over this array, and we'll pass that in. Okay, so basically what this does is it iterates over all of the items in the array you pass in, and for each one, it's going to return whatever you specify here. So if I said return foo for each one, and if we come back, now it'll be an array where each item is foo. So you'll find that you'll use mappings all of the time. So what you could do is say, well, right now task is an array, right? So you could say, yeah, I'm just going to be explicit about newing up a task. So this will be an empty task, but you get the basic idea. So then you could assign it. You could say task, and then task description equals task description. So you're just manually mapping everything over. So that would be an option as well. But I'm going to undo this and keep it to what we had before. And in fact, we don't even need to map it to a task. Simple classes are all we need in this case. So if I give this a refresh, I think it should still work. And it does. All right, so kind of cool. I know I threw a lot at you in this lesson. So let's take 2 minutes and go over everything. And then we will talk about some security and configuration. So now, index.php simply defers to a bootstrap file. And that's going to give us a query builder so that we can interact with our database. And once again, if you prefer, you can call that DB. You can name it anything you want. Just think to yourself, what is the best name so that I can understand exactly what this code does? All right? So the bootstrap file is sort of like we said, a little factory worker where he or she builds up a query builder. The query builder is responsible for building up SQL queries. So in this case, we just have one method to select everything from a particular table. Now, in order for that query builder to do its job, it requires, or it depends, upon a PDO instance. So that's where we delegate to this connection class. Now, the make method on that, it news it up and it returns it. So that means in our bootstrap file, new up the connection, get your PDO instance, and then pass it through or inject it through to the constructor of the query builder. And we accept it right there, and then we delegate. And that's it. So now, a tiny bit more complexity. There's some new stuff you've learned here, but we've improved our code quite a bit, especially at this current level that you are in your learning.